The sun bled crimson across the Wyoming plains, painting the jagged peaks of the Tetons in hues of fire and sorrow. Amos Creed, a widowed rancher with hands gnarled as the sagebrush, stood frozen at the edge of his property, his breath catching like a snagged wire. There, staked into the earth where his cattle grazed, was a wooden cross. Bound to it, her wrists raw and her face streaked with dirt, was a girl barely 16, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored the ache Amos had buried since his wife's death. Around her neck hung a sign, scrawled in jagged letters, "Come back when you're perfect." The words hit Amos like a bullet, unearthing memories of his own failures, his own imperfections, and the love he'd lost to the relentless grind of life. Amos was 62, a man carved by loss and labor. His wife, Clara, had died 5 years prior, taken by a cancer that spread as fast as wildfire. Since then, his days were a rhythm of solitude, tending his herd, mending fences, and whispering apologies to Clara's memory under the stars. His only son, Jacob, had fled the ranch at 18, chasing dreams in Denver and leaving Amos with nothing but echoes of their last fight. "You're too broken to fix, Dad." The words had lodged in Amos's chest, a splinter he couldn't pull free. Now, staring at the girl tied to the cross, those words roared back, mingling with the sign's cruel demand for perfection. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on frost-kissed grass. The girl flinched as he drew near, her breath hitching. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Amos said, his voice rough but steady, like gravel under a wagon wheel. He cut the ropes with his pocket knife, catching her as she sagged forward. She was light as a calf, trembling in his arms. "Who did this?" he asked, but her lips stayed sealed, her eyes darting to the horizon as if expecting her tormentor to emerge from the dusk. "Her name was Lila," she whispered later, after Amos had brought her to his cabin and wrapped her in Clara's old quilt. She'd run away from a foster home in Cheyenne, chasing rumors of a cousin in Montana who might take her in. Somewhere along the highway, she'd hitched a ride with the wrong man, a drifter with a silver tongue and a heart like coal. He'd preached about purity, about perfection, and when Lila argued, he'd bound her to that cross, leaving her as a warning to others. "He said I'd never be enough," she murmured, clutching a mug of coffee Amos had pressed into her hands. "Said nobody would want me till I was perfect." Amos's jaw tightened. He knew that kind of cruelty, the kind that burrowed into your soul and made you question your worth. He'd felt it when Clara died, when Jacob left, when the ranch's debts piled higher than the hay in his barn. He wanted to tell Lila she was enough, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he offered her a bed in the guest room and promised to call the sheriff in the morning. The first challenge came at dawn. Sheriff Danvers arrived, his hat in hand, but his news was grim. The drifter was a ghost, no name, no record, just a trail of rumors about a man preaching fire and brimstone across 3 states. Lila refused to go back to foster care, her eyes blazing with a defiance Amos recognized. "They'll just send me to another house that don't want me," she said. Against his better judgment, Amos agreed to let her stay a few days, telling himself it was temporary, that he wasn't fit to care for anyone, let alone a runaway with wounds as deep as his own. Days turned to weeks, and Lila became a quiet presence on the ranch. She learned to mend fences, to bottle feed the orphan calves, her hands quick and eager. But her silence spoke louder than her work. At night, Amos heard her crying through the thin walls, and he'd sit by the fire, wrestling with his own ghosts. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. His own grief had made him a stranger to comfort, and every time he tried to talk, the sign's words haunted him, "Come back when you're perfect." Was he enough to help her heal? Was anyone? The second challenge was the ranch itself. Winter was closing in, and Amos was behind on payments to the bank. A lean season had left his herd thin, and the feed costs were bleeding him dry. Lila noticed the worry etched into his face and threw herself into the work, suggesting they sell the old tractor to buy grain. "It's just sitting there, rusting," she said, her voice firm. Amos hesitated. Clara had loved that tractor, had driven it during their first harvest together, but Lila's pragmatism won out. They sold it, and for a moment, the ranch breathed easier. But Amos saw the cost in Lila's eyes. Every step forward felt like betraying Clara's memory. Then came the third challenge, Jacob. Word had reached Denver about the girl on Amos's ranch, and Jacob showed up unannounced, his city clothes out of place amid the dust and manure. "You're taking in strays now," he said, his tone sharp. Amos bristled, but Lila stepped between them, her chin high. "He's helping me," she said. "Something you might not understand." Jacob's visit unearthed old wounds, arguments about Clara's death, about Amos's stubbornness, about Jacob's abandonment. But Lila's presence forced them to talk, to listen. Over a tense dinner, Jacob admitted he'd regretted leaving, and Amos confessed he'd been too proud to ask him to stay. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The drifter's shadow loomed over them all. Lila's nightmares grew worse, and Amos found her one night staring at the cross, which he'd left standing as a reminder of what she'd survived. "Why'd you keep it?" she asked, her voice breaking. Amos didn't have an answer, but he took his axe and hacked it down, letting the wood splinter into the earth. Together, they burned the pieces, the flames licking the night sky. "You don't need to be perfect," Amos said, his voice thick. "You're enough as you are." The final challenge was the bank. A letter arrived, cold and final. Foreclosure was imminent unless Amos paid the overdue balance. Lila, now as much a part of the ranch as the fences she'd mended, rallied the community. She'd made friends in town at churchgoers, shopkeepers, even the gruff mechanic who'd bought the tractor. They organized a cattle drive, a spectacle that drew buyers from across the state. Jacob returned to help, his sleeves rolled up, his city polish gone. The drive was grueling. Blizzards threatened, a calf went missing, but they pushed through, Lila riding beside Amos, her face fierce with determination. They sold the herd at a profit, enough to save the ranch. By spring, Lila was no longer a runaway but a daughter in all but name. Amos had papers drawn up to become her legal guardian, and Jacob visited often, rebuilding what had been broken. The ranch thrived, not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs, flawed, scarred, and fiercely loved. Amos stood one evening on the porch, Lila beside him, watching the Tetons glow under a softening sky. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he told her. She smiled, a real smile, free of the cross's shadow.